Before the sun had even burned the haze off the Mediterranean Sea, two U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcats from F-41, the famed Black Aces, roared across the sky above the Gulf of Sidra. It was August 19, 1981, and the heat rising from the water below felt as thick as oil. But this wasn't a training flight. It wasn't a routine patrol. This was a reminder to the world that the United States would not be pushed around. Not by bluster, not by threats, and certainly not by a dictator drawing imaginary lines on the map. For years, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi had claimed that the entire Gulf of Sidra belonged to Libya. He drew what he called the line of death across international waters and warned that any American aircraft crossing it would be attacked. The United States didn't accept that for a second. International law was clear, and the U.S. Navy was not going to let Gaddafi rewrite the rule book just because he said so. So when President Reagan ordered a freedom of navigation operation in the region, American carriers headed straight toward the line, daring Libya to test them.
Air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activity.
The USS Nimitz was at the center of this mission, and from its deck, the Black Aces launched into the sky with a single purpose: uphold American freedom of navigation and respond with force if challenged. But even then, no one expected what would unfold that morning. No one expected the Navy's F-14 Tomcats to score the very first air-to-air kills in the jet's history. And no one expected Libya to be reckless enough to pick a fight with the most advanced naval fighters on the planet. As the Tomcats cruised at high altitude, Lieutenant Commander Hank Kleeman and Lieutenant Dave Venlet flew in one jet, while their wingmen, Lieutenant Lawrence Music Mujinski and Lieutenant Commander Jim Anderson, flew in the other. These weren't rookies. These were top-tier naval aviators operating one of the most feared fighters ever built. The Grumman F-14 Tomcat was a monster in the sky. Twin-engine, variable sweep wings, high-powered radar, and the unmatched ability to track multiple targets at long range. The Black Aces knew exactly what they were flying and exactly what they were defending. Then radar warning tones cut through the cockpits.
The leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, publicly confirmed his commitment to disclose and dismantle all weapons of mass destruction programs in his country.
The Tomcats had picked up fast-moving contacts coming in from the Libyan coastline. Two fighters, closing fast. Their altitude, their heading, their speed, everything pointed to an intercept. But the Americans stayed calm. They didn't turn aggressive. They held course and waited to see what these Libyan jets intended to do. Those jets were Soviet-built Su-22 fitters, ground attack aircraft that were never meant to go nose-to-nose with a U.S. Navy Tomcat. But they were armed, they were fast enough, and they were coming directly toward the American formation. Both Tomcats rolled into a defensive posture, giving the Libyans every opportunity to break away. Instead, the Su-22s closed the distance until they were only about 1,000 feet apart. That's nearly point-blank range in fighter combat, dangerously close. If the Libyans opened fire, the Tomcats would have only seconds to react. And then it happened. A flash streaked off the left wing of the lead Libyan jet. A missile, an AA-2 Atoll air-to-air missile, fired directly at the American F-14 commanded by Kleeman and Venlet. The missile shot out in front of the Tomcat, thanks to the American pilot's defensive maneuvering. It missed, but that wasn't the point. The line had been crossed. The Libyans had fired first. The fight was on. Even at high speed, the Tomcats reacted with astonishing precision. Kleeman pulled his aircraft into a tight turn, the wings automatically sweeping as the jet clawed through the sky. Mujinski and Anderson broke off to engage the second Libyan fighter. Now it wasn't about politics, borders, or rhetoric. It was simply survival, and the United States Navy was about to remind the world why its pilots were some of the deadliest aviators alive. Kleeman rolled in behind the Su-22 that had fired the missile. At this point, training took over. No rage, no panic, just years of disciplined preparation. He armed an AIM-9 Sidewinder, the Navy's short-range heat-seeking missile, and waited for that telltale growl in his headset. The Libyan fighter tried to break. It tried to shake the American off its tail. But there was no escaping a Tomcat locked in a firing solution. Kleeman squeezed the trigger. The Sidewinder dropped from the rail and spiraled toward its target in a brilliant white trail. Seconds later, it slammed into the Libyan Su-22. Fire erupted instantly as the jet broke apart. The pilot ejected, but as an enemy aircraft, it was officially out of the fight. Meanwhile, Muczynski and Anderson had closed in behind the second Libyan jet. This one attempted a shallow dive, possibly trying to outrun or confuse the Tomcat's sensors. But the F-14 was simply too advanced. Its engines were more powerful, its avionics more refined, its missiles far more lethal. Muczynski locked tone, that signature Sidewinder growl again. He fired. Another AIM-9 streaked into the sky, homing in on the Libyan fighter's engine exhaust. The missile struck true. The second Su-22 exploded in midair, debris scattering across the Gulf of Sidra. The pilot ejected just as the aircraft disintegrated behind him. 2 Libyan fighter jets had attacked the U.S. Navy. 2 Libyan jets had been destroyed, and the U.S. F-14 Tomcats suffered 0 damage, 0 losses, and 0 hesitation in defending themselves. The entire engagement lasted less than a minute. In the aftermath, the American pilots called out the shootdowns with the same calm professionalism you'd expect from men trained to make life-or-death decisions in seconds. They rejoined formation, checked in with controllers aboard the USS Nimitz, and returned to their patrol. There was no chest beating, no dramatic speeches, just another day in the life of American naval aviation, and the day the F-14 Tomcat officially proved itself in combat. Word spread fast across the fleet. The F-14 had been controversial in its early years, expensive, complex, and at times misunderstood by those who never flew it. But for the men who strapped into that fighter, the Gulf of Sidra incident settled the debate forever. The Tomcat wasn't just a showpiece. It was a weapon, a guardian, a predator in the sky. For Libya, the message was unmistakable. Gaddafi's line of death was a political bluff, and his attempt to enforce it with force had failed instantly.
Gaddafi's record is horrendous, and that's not a record that you could ever expunge.
The United States had not crossed the line to provoke. The U.S. Navy crossed the line because it had every legal right to operate there. And when fired upon, American pilots responded decisively and with overwhelming superiority.
In every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Back home, the news reached the American public with a surge of pride. At a time when Cold War tensions were still deep and global conflicts simmered everywhere, the Gulf of Sidra incident was a reminder that the United States still commanded the skies. Even the Soviet Union took notice. Their aircraft, used by Libya, had been brushed aside by U.S. naval aviators who demonstrated not only better technology, but better training, better discipline, and better judgment. For the men of VF-41, the shootdowns were added to squadron history as a badge of honor. 2 kills, 0 losses. First blood for the F-14 Tomcat. And for years, those victories became part of naval aviation lore, studied in training, celebrated in ready rooms, and remembered every time a Tomcat crew walked out to the flight deck. But the incident wasn't just about aircraft or geopolitics. It was about the men in those cockpits. Kleeman, Venlet, Muczynski, Anderson, professionals who trusted their aircraft, trusted each other, and trusted the training that kept them alive. When the moment came, they didn't hesitate. They didn't freeze. They performed. The Gulf of Sidra engagement proved something far larger than a simple tactical victory. It showed that American resolve wasn't just a slogan. When pushed, the United States pushed back harder. When fired upon, the U.S. military didn't crumble. It responded with clear, lethal, controlled force. And that's why this incident still stands today as one of the defining moments in naval aviation. The first F-14 kills. The first time the Tomcat sank its claws into the enemy. And a moment that announced to adversaries everywhere, challenge the United States at your own risk. The Gulf of Sidra may look like any ordinary stretch of blue water on the map, but on that August morning in 1981, it became a battlefield that proved American superiority beyond any doubt. 2 Tomcats entered the fight. 2 Libyan fighters tried to test them, and in less than a minute, the question of who owned the sky was answered forever. From that day forward, no one looked at the F-14 Tomcat the same way again. It was no longer just a carrier fighter. It was a symbol, a reminder that when American pilots strapped into their jets, they carried not just missiles and fuel, but decades of training, courage, and commitment. And for the 60-year-old Americans who watched the news that night, many of whom had lived through Vietnam, the Cold War, and years of geopolitical tension, it was a moment of reassurance. A moment where the United States didn't back down. A moment where American strength spoke louder than any speech or threat. This is why the Gulf of Sidra incident is remembered. Not because it was long, not because it was complex, but because it was decisive. It was fast. It was clean. And it showed exactly what happens when the United States Navy gets pushed. The Black Aces walked away from that fight undefeated, unshaken, and unchallenged. The Tomcat earned its reputation in seconds. And on that morning in the Gulf of Sidra, the world learned, once again, that American air power was not to be trifled with.